In the small, quiet town of Hollow Creek, life had always been simple. The morning mist would hover over the sleepy streets, and the sun would slowly rise over the nearby hills. People knew each other's names, waved as they passed, and worked hard to maintain a peaceful existence. But on the evening of April 12th, that peaceful silence was broken. It began with an eerie stillness. The wind stopped blowing, the birds stopped singing, and the usual hum of the town's nightly activities came to a halt. At first, no one thought much of it. People assumed it was just a strange coincidence or perhaps some technical malfunction with the power grid. After all, Hollow Creek had never experienced anything out of the ordinary before. Emily Jacobs, a young high school teacher, sat in her living room, sipping her tea, staring out the window. She had just finished grading papers and was looking forward to a quiet evening. The world seemed unnaturally still. Her phone buzzed, a message from her sister, Julia, asking if she was coming to dinner at their parents' house. Emily quickly typed back, saying she would be there shortly, but as she got up to leave, she froze. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the tension in the air. The house felt too quiet, like something was waiting to happen. Emily shook it off and left her house, stepping into the streets of Hollow Creek. The town was just as still as her home, and as she walked, the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Not a soul was in sight. Normally, the town would still have a few stragglers at the local diner or the corner store, but tonight there was nothing. As she approached her parents' house on the outskirts of town, she noticed the same unsettling silence. No lights, no sound. It was as if the town had been frozen in time. A chill ran down her spine. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Her heart pounded in her chest. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Meanwhile, across town, David Simmons, the local sheriff, was standing in the middle of Main Street, staring at the horizon. The usual rush of cars heading in and out of town had stopped hours ago. His radio had fallen silent, and his calls to the state police had gone unanswered. He had tried calling the mayor, the fire department, even his own deputy, but there was no response. The entire town seemed cut off from the outside world. A strange unease crept over him. David's thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash from down the street. His heart skipped a beat. Slowly, he walked toward the source of the noise, hoping it was nothing more than an accident or a blown-over trash can. But when he rounded the corner, he was met with something much worse. The town's diner had been torn apart, its windows shattered. The front door lay open, swaying in the wind. Inside, the dim light revealed a horrifying sight: empty, overturned chairs, broken plates, and food scattered across the floor. Blood stained the walls in dark, unsettling patterns. But what truly sent a shiver down David's spine were the faint, dragging footprints leading to the back door. His instincts kicked in, and he rushed inside, hand on his gun, every nerve on edge. The diner was eerily quiet, but the air felt thick with something unspoken. What had happened here? Just as he was about to investigate further, a low groan echoed from the back room. David's heart hammered in his chest, but he slowly made his way toward the sound, his gun raised. He rounded the corner and froze. A man, disheveled and covered in blood, was hunched over the kitchen counter, his hands clawing at a half-eaten meal. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. He looked up slowly, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque snarl. His lips parted, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth, and without warning, he lunged at David. In the chaos that followed, David barely managed to dodge the man's attack. His heart raced, and his mind screamed for him to get out of the diner. He fired a shot, but the man was too quick, spinning away from the bullet with a twisted scream. David realized that the figure before him wasn't a man at all, it was something else. Something far worse. Back at Emily's parents' house, she was beginning to panic. She called out for her parents, but there was no answer. As she searched the house, she noticed strange signs: broken furniture, overturned lamps, and the unmistakable scent of something rotten in the air. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from her friend Sarah, asking if Emily was okay. Sarah was the one person who had always shared her suspicions about the strange happenings around town, but they had laughed it off as conspiracy theories. Now, it seemed there was no denying the truth. Something was terribly wrong. Emily typed back frantically, "I don't know what's happening, but I think we're in danger. Get to my house, now." As she ended the message, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Slowly, she turned, her heart in her throat. What she saw made her blood run cold. Standing in the doorway was her mother, her eyes empty, her skin deathly pale. She didn't look like her mother anymore. Not really. In the distance, the first faint sounds of sirens could be heard. But it was too late. The world was about to change forever. And Hollow Creek would never be the same again. The first few minutes after the encounter in the diner left David disoriented and shaken. He backed out of the room, breathing hard, his pulse quickening with each step he took. The man, no, the creature, had come at him like an animal, with no human trace left in its behavior. It wasn't the way someone fought to survive, it was the way something fought to feed. David had seen violence in his years as sheriff, but this was something else. There was no reason to this attack, no cry for help, just an unrelenting, primal hunger. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay focused. The entire town could be in danger. He couldn't afford to let fear cloud his judgment. He pulled out his radio again, only to hear static. It was as if every communication channel had been severed. Panic crept up on him. Was it an isolated incident, or was something bigger at play? A scream echoed from the other side of town, sharp and full of terror. David instinctively started running toward the sound. His instincts told him that the worst was yet to come. Back at Emily's parents' house, she stood frozen in the living room. Her mother, once the warm, comforting figure who had raised her, now stood in the doorway with her arms stretched out, her body stiff. Her pale, lifeless eyes locked on Emily. She didn't speak, she didn't move, except for her slow, deliberate steps toward her daughter. "Mom?" Emily's voice cracked as she backed away. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the terrifying figure that had once been her mother. This wasn't her mother anymore. This was something else, something unrecognizable. She glanced around for anything to defend herself with but found only the broken remnants of her childhood home. Her mind raced for a solution. Should she run? Should she try to fight? But before she could make a decision, her mother lunged. The impact knocked Emily to the ground, her back slamming into the hardwood floor. A low growl rumbled from her mother's throat, and she pinned Emily down, her hands cold and unmoving as they grasped at her shoulders. It was then that Emily saw the deep gashes on her mother's neck, wounds that were still fresh and oozing dark, almost black blood. This wasn't just any attack. Emily realized, in horror, that the creatures weren't just coming out of nowhere. There had been an infection, a sickness. But how had it spread so quickly? How had it reached Hollow Creek? With all her strength, Emily shoved her mother off her and scrambled to her feet. She ran for the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. The sound of her mother's footsteps echoed behind her. She barely made it outside, slamming the door behind her and running down the front steps. Emily didn't look back, but she could hear her mother's raspy breathing growing closer. The streets of Hollow Creek, usually so safe and familiar, now felt like a maze of terror. It wasn't just her mother. Emily realized with a sinking feeling that the whole town had been overtaken. Whatever was happening wasn't just an isolated event. It was the beginning of something far worse. The silence had given way to the chaos of a world gone wrong. She reached her car and drove down the streets in a panic, weaving between abandoned vehicles and overturned street signs. The sounds of screams and guttural growls filled the air. The town she had known all her life was falling apart around her. David's heart raced as he reached the source of the scream. It came from the direction of the high school, where a group of students had apparently tried to make a run for it. Now, they were trapped between the school and the woods, surrounded by the undead creatures. David skidded to a halt, jumping out of his squad car. His hand instinctively went for his gun, but he quickly realized that guns wouldn't stop these things. He had to think. The students were disoriented, and there were too many creatures for him to take on alone. But he couldn't just leave them. With his hand still on his weapon, David shouted for the students to take cover. They didn't hesitate, scrambling into the nearby woods, their eyes wide with panic. David didn't give them a second thought. He turned on his heel and headed toward the school, hoping he could find some sort of weapon or resource that would help him fight back. But the closer he got to the school, the more evident it became that Hollow Creek was far from normal. The creatures seemed to be everywhere, lurching from every shadow, and David's breath quickened with each step. As he reached the school's entrance, the glass doors shattered, and a flood of those things poured out, their eyes fixed on him. He stumbled back in shock, barely managing to dodge the first creature that lunged at him. He fired a shot instinctively, but it didn't stop the creature. It kept coming, relentless, its hands outstretched, clawing at him. David didn't have time to react before another one appeared at his side. He barely managed to duck as its sharp claws swiped through the air above him. In that moment, David realized that he had no chance on his own. This wasn't just an outbreak. It was an invasion. Hollow Creek had become ground zero for a nightmare that was spreading faster than anyone could comprehend. And somewhere, deep within the town, Emily was still out there, alone, terrified, and trying to survive. The streets of Hollow Creek were now unrecognizable. The once peaceful town was shrouded in chaos, the darkness of the night compounded by the sinister force that had overtaken it. What had once been a place of comfort and security was now a battlefield, where the living fought to survive against the terrifying wave of the undead. David stumbled down the street, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. The gunfire had died down, replaced by the groans and growls of the creatures now roaming the streets in search of their next victim. It was clear that the small town had no chance of fending them off for long. The entire population had been taken by surprise. There were no warnings, no signs of what was to come, just an abrupt shift from normal life to total, unimaginable horror. David had no plan. He wasn't sure if anyone had a plan. There were no emergency protocols for something like this. No training for fighting off an apocalypse. Yet here he was, trying to make sense of it all, trying to keep his wits together. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. The first thing David did after hearing the screams was make his way to the town's emergency shelter, hoping it was still standing. He had to find shelter for anyone who was still alive and wasn't yet overrun by the chaos. There was a chance the local church might have been spared. He'd been there earlier that day for a town meeting. It was a sturdy building with thick stone walls. If there were any survivors, that was their best bet for now. As David made his way through the abandoned streets, he noticed more and more of the creatures shuffling past, some staggering aimlessly, while others appeared to be hunting. The air was thick with the putrid smell of decay, and the sight of their bloodied, broken bodies sent waves of nausea through him. He could barely stomach the thought of what these creatures used to be, neighbors, family members, the familiar faces that had once filled Hollow Creek's small-town community. Now, they were nothing more than empty shells, driven by an insatiable hunger. Meanwhile, Emily had driven as far as she could, her mind racing in terror. She hadn't seen her mother since her escape from the house, and she wasn't sure if she was still alive or if the woman she had seen was even her mother anymore. As she swerved around abandoned cars, she couldn't help but wonder how much of the world was still standing. Was it just Hollow Creek that had been hit, or had the entire world been overtaken by whatever was spreading so rapidly? She had to find shelter. Her thoughts flickered to Sarah, her best friend who had sent the frantic text earlier. She needed to get to Sarah's house, but there was no telling what she would find when she got there. Her town was falling apart around her, and Emily was terrified that it might be too late for anyone to be safe. Her car came to an abrupt stop as she neared the town square. In the distance, she could see figures stumbling in the streets, but these were different from the mindless undead she had encountered at her parents' house. These were survivors, struggling to escape the relentless creatures. Emily's eyes widened as she saw David in the distance, moving cautiously through the town, heading toward the shelter. She had to get to him, he was the only one who might know what to do. She quickly threw the car in park, grabbing a heavy flashlight from the passenger seat. She wasn't sure how much good it would do, but she needed something to defend herself. With the flashlight clenched in her hand, Emily sprinted toward David, hoping he would recognize her. She had no idea if he even knew what was going on, but if anyone had a chance of making sense of the madness, it was him. As she approached, she called out, her voice trembling. "David! David, it's Emily!" David paused for a moment, hearing the faint sound of someone calling his name through the cacophony of distant growls and screams. He turned, eyes searching the darkness. When he saw Emily, he let out a breath of relief, though it was short-lived. "Emily, what are you doing out here?" David's voice was strained, his eyes scanning the street as if the monsters might appear at any moment. I had to find you," Emily said breathlessly, catching her breath as she approached him. "I don't know what's happening, David. My mom, she's not herself. I don't know how to explain it. I think they're turning people into those things. I think everyone's infected." David's expression hardened, his worst fears beginning to take shape. "I've seen them. We need to get out of here, now." He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the nearby alley, away from the main road where the creatures were roaming freely. They ran as fast as they could, moving silently through the shadows. The shelter wasn't far, but getting there wasn't going to be easy. As they neared the corner, they saw a group of those things, growing in number, their movements jerky and erratic, stumbling around the corner. David cursed under his breath. There was no way around them. "We can't go that way," David whispered urgently. "They're everywhere." Emily's heart raced. She was scared, more scared than she had ever been, but the one thing she clung to was the fact that she wasn't alone. She had David with her. And as long as they stayed together, there was hope. They needed to find a way out. They needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere they could regroup. But with the town overrun and the world outside uncertain, it was hard to say what could possibly still be waiting for them. The night was thick with tension. The once familiar town of Hollow Creek had become a maze of shadows and death. As David and Emily crouched in the alley, the growls of the undead reverberated in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. They needed to move quickly, but every step felt like a gamble. David's eyes darted around, scanning the dark corners and alleys, trying to plan their next move. The shelter, their only hope, was still a few blocks away. But as the creatures continued to wander the streets, the risk of encountering them was higher than ever. The clock was ticking. They had no time to waste. "We can't keep running forever," Emily whispered, her voice strained with fear. "There has to be a place where we can hold up and figure this out." David glanced at her, his expression grim. "I know, but the shelter's the only safe place left. If we don't get there soon, the whole town could be lost." A low groan echoed from behind them. David's heart skipped a beat as he spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But it was no use. The creature was already too close. With a roar, it lunged at them, its eyes wide with hunger. It wasn't human anymore, not even close. Its face was contorted, skin peeling away from the bones, and its movements were erratic, driven purely by instinct. Before David could react, Emily swung the flashlight with all her might, striking the creature in the side of the head. The impact stunned it for a moment, but it quickly recovered, snarling as it reached for her. Panic surged through Emily's veins, but David was already on the move. He tackled the creature to the ground, struggling to hold it down as it snapped at him. "Emily, move!" David yelled, his voice desperate. "Get to the shelter. Now!" Emily hesitated, fear gripping her heart. But she knew David was right. The longer they stayed here, the more likely they were to be surrounded. She turned and ran, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her legs burning with every stride. David fought with everything he had, finally pulling the creature off him and shoving it aside. But just as he thought it was over, he heard another growl from behind him. He spun around, but this time, there were more of them. At least half a dozen creatures were closing in, their eyes fixed on him with unrelenting hunger. He couldn't fight them all. Not here. Not like this. He turned and sprinted after Emily, shouting for her to hurry. He wasn't sure how long they could outrun the creatures, but the shelter was their only hope. There was no time to think about anything else. They rounded a corner and came face to face with a wall of undead. They were everywhere, clawing at the sides of buildings, searching for any sign of life. David's heart pounded as he realized they were trapped. The street was blocked on all sides, and the creatures were closing in fast. "We're not making it," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the deafening growls. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She had never imagined that something like this could happen, not in Hollow Creek. Not in their small, quiet town. David took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. There had to be a way out. There had to be a chance for them to survive. "We need to make a stand," David said, his voice steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm him. "We can't run anymore. We'll fight." Emily's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "Fight? With what? We're outnumbered." David looked around, trying to find anything they could use. His gaze landed on a nearby abandoned truck. It was old and rusted, but it was something. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The truck had a reinforced steel frame, a perfect barricade. "We can use the truck," David said, his mind racing. "We'll get inside, block the doors, and hold them off until morning. We just have to make it until dawn." Emily nodded, swallowing her fear. "Let's do it." Together, they ran toward the truck, dodging the creatures that lurked in their path. They reached it just as one of the monsters lunged at them, but David was quick to react. He fired a shot, hitting the creature square in the chest. It collapsed to the ground, motionless. They climbed into the back of the truck, pulling the heavy metal gate down behind them. For a brief moment, there was silence, a fleeting sense of safety. But it wouldn't last long. The creatures were already circling the truck, banging against the sides with their grotesque hands. The noise was deafening. David grabbed a long metal rod that was lying on the truck's bed and held it in a defensive stance. "We fight. We survive. That's all we can do." Emily nodded, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The first creature reached the truck, its hands clawing at the metal. Emily swung the flashlight at its arm, but the blow barely fazed it. David lunged forward with the metal rod, striking the creature in the head. The impact sent it sprawling to the ground, but more were coming. More were always coming. They fought back as best they could, swinging, kicking, and stabbing whenever possible. But the creatures just kept coming, an endless wave of hunger and decay. Every second felt like an eternity, every strike a desperate plea for survival. As the hours passed, their energy began to drain, and their hope began to waver. But neither David nor Emily dared to stop. The creatures outside seemed relentless, their growls growing louder, their numbers swelling. The night stretched on, and with every moment, Hollow Creek seemed further and further away from the peaceful town it had once been. And then, as if by some miracle, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The first light of dawn spilled across the sky, casting a soft, golden glow over Hollow Creek. For a moment, it felt like a distant dream, like everything might go back to normal if they just waited a little longer. But David knew better. The world had changed, and the night had only been the beginning. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the creatures outside the truck grew restless. They had been relentlessly attacking the barricades for hours, their hands leaving deep gashes in the metal. But as the daylight crept in, the creatures seemed to lose some of their drive. Their movements became slower, more erratic, as if the light itself was somehow hurting them. David dared to hope. "Emily," David whispered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We need to go. Now." Emily had fallen silent, her back pressed against the truck's side as she gripped the flashlight tightly in her hands. Her body was covered in dirt and blood, and her once bright eyes were now dull with exhaustion. But despite the fatigue that weighed down on her, she nodded and stood up, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they pushed open the metal gate slowly, the creak of it nearly as loud as the growls of the undead that still roamed around them. The sunlight bathed the town in a surreal light, casting long shadows over the ruined streets. The chaos of the night before felt distant, as though it belonged to another world. But Hollow Creek was still standing, and that was something. David scanned the area, his eyes darting from corner to corner, looking for signs of danger. There was an eerie stillness in the air now, as if the creatures had retreated into the shadows, waiting for the cover of night to return. He didn't trust it. Not yet. "We need to head toward the church," David said, his voice calm but urgent. "There might be survivors. We'll find out if it's safe there." Emily's eyes flickered with doubt, but she didn't question him. He was right. The church had always been a symbol of safety, of community, and it was their best chance of finding others who had survived the night. They couldn't just leave without knowing who else was still out there. With weapons in hand, they cautiously moved out of the truck, stepping lightly over the broken glass and debris that littered the street. The air was thick with the smell of decay, but the light of the new day gave them hope. Each step felt like a small victory, a step closer to survival. Yet every corner they turned could bring more danger. There were no guarantees anymore. As they neared the church, the silence of the town weighed heavily on them. Hollow Creek had always been a place of calm, where everyone knew everyone else. But now, it was as if the town had been swallowed whole by the darkness. The familiar buildings loomed like silent sentinels, their windows shattered, their doors left ajar. When they reached the church, they found the doors locked tight. David knocked, hoping against hope that someone was still inside. No response. He tried again, harder this time, his knuckles rapping against the wood. Silence. "Hello?" Emily called out, her voice trembling as she stepped forward. "Is anyone in there?" There was no answer, only the sound of their own breathing in the eerie stillness. David's stomach sank. The church had been a haven, a place where people gathered when things got tough. It felt wrong that no one was there now. David placed his hand on the door, pushing gently. It creaked open just enough for them to see inside. The pews were overturned, the stained glass windows shattered, and the altar had been desecrated. It was as if the creatures had been there too. But then, a movement. A figure stepped into view, a survivor. David's breath caught in his chest. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice shaky but relieved. The man, middle-aged with graying hair and a weary face, stepped into the light. His clothes were torn, and there was a jagged cut across his cheek. But he was alive. "We're fine," David said, his voice steady. "But we need help. Is there anyone else here?" The man's face hardened. "Not many. Most of us, well, we didn't make it. I'm Father James." He paused, scanning the street outside. "I thought I was the only one left." David could see the sorrow in Father James's eyes. The church had once been full of life, of hope, and now it was a graveyard for the living. But they were alive. That was something. And as long as they had breath in their lungs, there was still hope. "We need to find others," Emily said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "We can't be the only ones." Father James nodded, taking a deep breath. "There may be a few more scattered around. I've been trying to get a signal on the radio, but no luck so far. The world's different now. We need to band together if we want to survive." David glanced at Emily, then back at Father James. This was the moment when survival stopped being about just staying alive and became about finding others, rebuilding, and doing whatever it took to reclaim their world. "We'll help you," David said, his voice resolute. "We'll fight for this town. We'll fight for each other." Emily, though quiet, stood by his side. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said it all. They were in this together. Father James smiled weakly, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes. We'll rebuild Hollow Creek, one step at a time." David and Emily followed Father James into the church, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't alone. There was something powerful in the presence of others, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. It wasn't over yet. They still had a long road ahead of them, but together, they might just stand a chance. The interior of the church was dim, with only the faint light from the broken stained glass windows casting colorful patterns across the floor. Despite the church's disarray, there was an odd sense of calm inside. The smell of stale air and old wood mingled with the scent of smoke and blood from the night before. Still, the quiet was welcome, a brief respite from the horrors outside. David, Emily, and Father James sat around a small table in the corner, where a few makeshift supplies were spread out, old canned goods, a few bottles of water, and a scattered stack of papers. On the table was a battered, hand-cranked radio that Father James had been using in an attempt to contact other survivors. It had crackled to life once or twice, but the message was always garbled and unintelligible. Hope seemed to dwindle with each failed attempt. "We need to make a plan," David said, leaning forward. "We can't stay here forever. We need to find other survivors, secure more supplies, and figure out what's really happening out there. It's not just the town, it's the whole world that's falling apart." Emily nodded, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. She had been quiet since they arrived at the church, her mind still processing everything. The nightmarish images of what they'd seen, the people they'd lost, haunted her. Father James sighed heavily, rubbing his eyes as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "I don't know how much longer we'll be safe here. The creatures, whatever they are everywhere. We've been lucky that they haven't found this place yet, but I fear it's only a matter of time before they do." David studied the map spread across the table, pointing to several locations he thought might be of interest. "We need to get to the old mill. It's outside of town, and it's a fortified structure. If we can get there, we might have a better chance at setting up a secure base. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the worse it will get." Father James glanced at the map, his fingers tracing the routes David had outlined. "The mill. It's a good idea, but the route will be treacherous. The streets are crawling with those things. We won't be able to just walk there without drawing attention." David nodded, aware of the risks. "We'll have to take the back roads, avoid the main streets as much as possible. We can't afford to fight every single one we come across. But if we're lucky, we can make it through without attracting too much notice." Emily stood up abruptly, the weight of the conversation settling heavily in her chest. "We can't just keep running. What if there's nowhere left to hide? What if there are no more survivors out there?" Her voice cracked with the raw emotion that she had been holding back for so long. David met her gaze, his expression softening. He knew what she was feeling, the fear that gripped her heart, the uncertainty that gnawed at their every decision. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a sense of comfort amidst the chaos. "We're not running, Em. We're fighting. And as long as we keep moving, we'll find a way to survive. We're not giving up." Emily gave a faint nod, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. She didn't fully believe him, not yet. But his words, though simple, held a promise. A promise that they wouldn't just fade into the background of the apocalypse. Father James stood, his heavy boots echoing against the stone floor as he walked toward the small altar. His hands rested on the wooden surface, as though seeking solace from something higher, something that had abandoned them all. "We'll need weapons. And more supplies than we have here. If we're going to make it to the mill, we'll need to gather everything we can." David agreed. They had enough food and water to last a few days, but that wouldn't be enough to survive a long journey. They needed to be fully prepared, or they wouldn't make it far. "We'll head out tomorrow morning. Rest up tonight, get what we need, and we'll go. No more waiting." The plan was set, but the uncertainty of what awaited them weighed heavily on everyone's mind. The world outside was different now, a world where survival didn't just mean food and water, but also courage, strength, and an unyielding will to live. As they began to gather their things, Father James took a deep breath, looking out at the empty pews. "I used to tell my congregation that faith would carry them through the toughest times. But I'm starting to wonder if it's not just faith we need. It's strength. Real strength, from within. David paused, turning to face the older man. We've got that strength, Father. We've made it this far. We can make it farther. Father James looked at him, a tired but genuine smile forming on his lips. Then we'll fight. Together. That night, they rested in the church, knowing it could be the last time they had the luxury of peace. The night was still, save for the distant growls of the undead. The creatures were out there, always lurking, always waiting. But for the first time in a long while, David, Emily, and Father James felt like they had a purpose again. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting back. And for that brief moment, that was enough. The early morning light had barely touched the horizon when David, Emily, and Father James set out from the church. The town of Hollow Creek was still as they walked through its empty streets, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant groan of a creature lurking in the shadows. Despite the calm, an oppressive tension hung in the air. Every corner, every doorway, felt like a potential trap. But they couldn't afford to be cautious forever. Time was running out. We'll take the side roads, David said, his voice low but resolute. He kept his eyes on the map, carefully marking their route. We can avoid the main roads as much as possible. The more we stay out of sight, the better. Emily nodded, though there was still uncertainty in her eyes. She had seen what happened when people underestimated the creatures, when they thought they could slip by unnoticed. It was never that easy. The creatures might be slow, but they had an uncanny ability to track the living, drawn to movement, sound, and scent. Father James, his shotgun slung over his shoulder, walked beside her, his footsteps steady but wary. Let's keep our heads down. We don't want to draw attention. As they made their way through the town's outskirts, the familiar landmarks began to fade into the background. The once bustling shops, the local diner, and the school, the places they had all known so well, now stood as empty shells, remnants of a life that felt like a distant memory. It was a harsh reminder that the world they knew was gone, and all that remained was survival. The wind picked up as they left the last of the town's buildings behind, and the smell of decay and burning would hung thick in the air. As they moved deeper into the countryside, the fields stretched out before them, wide and endless. But with the open space came new dangers. The creatures weren't confined to the town, they were everywhere. The dense forest on either side of them could be hiding dozens of the undead, waiting for an opportunity to strike. David held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. They crouched behind an old fence, surveying the landscape. The road ahead looked clear, but that didn't mean it was safe. They had learned the hard way that the quiet moments were often the most dangerous. Keep your eyes peeled, David whispered, his hand resting on the machete at his side. We don't know what's ahead. Emily's gaze swept across the open fields. In the distance, she could just make out the faint outline of the mill. It was still a long way off, but it seemed closer now, a glimmer of hope on the horizon. The journey would take time, but every step brought them closer to safety, or so they hoped. As they started walking again, they passed the remains of an old farmhouse. Its roof had collapsed, and the walls were charred black from a fire that had consumed everything inside. The hollow shell of the house was a grim reminder of what had happened to the world. The creatures had wiped out everything in their path, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. I wonder how many others are out there, Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. How many people are still alive? David glanced over at her, his expression somber. I don't know. But we can't keep wondering. We have to keep moving, keep fighting. Father James turned to them, his brow furrowed with concern. And what if we don't find anyone else? What if we're the last ones left? David's gaze hardened. Then we'll make a new world. One where we don't just survive, we live. We rebuild. But only if we keep pushing forward. As they continued down the road, the tension among them grew. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding, as though something unseen was watching them from the shadows. The quiet was oppressive, every crack of a twig or rustle in the wind sending a wave of unease through their group. They couldn't afford to relax, not for a second. A few miles later, they reached a small bridge that spanned a dried-up creek. The bridge looked sturdy enough, but as they crossed, the sound of footsteps reached their ears. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. David motioned for them to stop, his body tense. They crouched down, taking cover behind the bridge's support beams. The creatures were close, too close. David's hand went to his machete. "Stay quiet. Don't move until I say so." Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she felt her pulse quicken as the footsteps grew louder. She could see shadows moving at the edge of the trees. There were at least 4 of them, their slow, shuffling gait unmistakable. Father James's fingers tightened around his shotgun, his knuckles turning white. They had come so far, but if they weren't careful, this could be the end. They waited in silence, the creatures now only a few feet away. Each one was more grotesque than the last, pale, decayed faces, hollow eyes, and the smell of rot emanating from their rotting bodies. One of the creatures stopped, its head turning in their direction, its nostrils flaring as if it could sense them nearby. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her, but there was no room for fear now. She couldn't let herself panic. They had made it this far. They couldn't fail now. David's grip on his machete tightened as he prepared to move. The moment was coming. "On my signal," he whispered. "We make a run for it. Keep low. Stay close." The creatures were only a few steps away, and it was now or never. David counted to 3, his heart racing. Now. They moved as one, sprinting across the bridge and into the cover of the trees, the creatures' growls echoing in their ears. The chase had begun. The sound of shuffling feet echoed behind them, and the heavy, ragged breaths of the creatures sent chills down Emily's spine. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not now. They had made it this far, survived so much, and she wasn't going to let it all end in a sprint through the woods. David was leading the way, cutting through the dense underbrush with a machete, clearing a path as they pushed forward. Father James was behind Emily, his shotgun raised, watching their rear. The creatures had started following them almost immediately after they crossed the bridge, but David had a plan. They couldn't keep running forever, but they could use the terrain to their advantage. "We're almost there," David shouted over his shoulder, his voice tinged with urgency. "The mill is just up ahead." The trees began to thin as they neared the edge of the forest. Emily could see the silhouette of the old mill in the distance, standing like a dark sentinel against the sky. It seemed close, but in this moment, with the creatures hot on their heels, it might as well have been miles away. The sounds of the chase were getting louder, more creatures had joined the pursuit. The first few had been slow, but as they'd moved, the others had been drawn to the noise, the movement. Now they were in a full-on pursuit. Emily's heart raced as her thoughts flashed to the mill. It was supposed to be a safe haven, but what if the creatures had already overrun it? What if they were running toward their own demise? "We need to make it to the building," David yelled. "Stay close. Don't let them catch us." As they emerged from the trees, the full size of the mill came into view. The old stone structure loomed like a fortress, its thick walls and weathered windows offering a sense of security, even if it was just a fleeting illusion. The front door was shut, and as they neared it, David's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped against hope that they would find it locked but still intact. "Get to the door," David shouted, his voice hoarse. He was already moving toward it, his hand outstretched. Emily's legs screamed in protest as she sprinted after him, Father James close behind. The creatures were growing closer now, and there was no time to waste. Emily reached the door just as David did, and together they pushed it open with all their might. It creaked on its hinges, and for a heart-stopping moment, it seemed as though it might resist them. Then, with a final shove, it opened wide enough for them to slip through. They tumbled inside, gasping for breath as the door slammed shut behind them. The inside of the mill was dark and musty, but there was a certain sense of safety now that the door was sealed. The thick stone walls and reinforced windows were a welcome sight. They had made it. They were safe, at least for now. Emily collapsed to her knees, panting as she tried to catch her breath. She could still hear the faint growls of the creatures outside, but the door held. For a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down, and she allowed herself a breath of relief. They had survived. "We need to barricade the door," David said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline still pumping through him. "We don't know how long it will hold. We can't afford to be complacent." Father James nodded and immediately moved toward a pile of wooden planks stacked in the corner of the room. He began to hammer them against the door, securing it as best as he could. The sound of nails striking wood was oddly comforting. It meant they were still fighting. Emily stood, shakily brushing dirt from her clothes as she surveyed the interior of the mill. It was sparse, but it would do. There was a loft above them, a few shelves lined with old, dust-covered tools, and enough space to move around. It wasn't a long-term solution, but it was a safe haven for now. "We'll need to search for supplies," David said, taking a quick inventory of the room. "Food, water, and anything that can help us defend ourselves. We can't be sure how long we'll be here, but this is the best shot we have." Father James finished barricading the door and joined them. "What if there are more of them out there?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the room. "What if this isn't enough? We've seen how quickly they can swarm." David's jaw tightened as he looked toward the narrow windows, which provided only a limited view of the surrounding land. The wind howled outside, and the growls of the undead creatures were growing fainter. But it wasn't over. It was never over. "We'll stay vigilant," David said, his voice low but firm. "We can't let our guard down. We can't afford to trust that just because they're not here now, they won't come back. But we have a chance. We've made it this far, and we're not going to give up." Emily nodded, though doubt still lingered in her heart. The world they had known was gone. The creatures that roamed outside were relentless, but so were they. Together, they had survived. And together, they would keep fighting. The mill had been their refuge, a place to regroup, to gather strength. But beyond its walls, the world was still broken. The undead still walked the earth. And though they had made it here, there was no guarantee that this would be the end of the road. But for now, in the stillness of the mill, they had survived the silence. And that was enough. End of Part 8. End of story.